Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Mercer called her when he thought she couldn't hear. He said it to the surgical residents rotating through pediatrics, said it loud enough for half the unit to catch it, said it with the kind of dismissive ease that came from never being told no. Laura Bennett had worked at St. Michael's for 18 months, and in that time she had become expert at the art of disappearing in plain sight, her long sleeves despite the July heat in Raleigh, her eyes down during rounds, her voice soft enough that people forgot they'd heard it. They didn't know she was running calculations in her head while he ordered supplies. They didn't know that the burn scars running up both her forearms told the story of a field hospital in Helmand province where she'd held 14 lives together with her bare hands while the walls came down around her. What happened next didn't just change her shift, it changed everything. The pediatric wing of St. Michael's hummed with its morning rhythm. Monitors beat their steady electronic pulse. A child cried somewhere down the hall, not pain, just the particular exhaustion of being 3 years old in a hospital gown. Laura moved through the unit with the economical precision of someone who had learned long ago that wasted motion meant wasted time, and wasted time meant people died. She restocked the crash cart at 0630, running her fingers along each compartment, 14-gauge angiocath needles arranged by size, defibrillator pads checked for adhesion, the epinephrine in the correct concentration, 1 mg per milliliter. Her movements were fluid, automatic, the muscle memory of 7 years spent in places where hesitation was fatal. The morning light filtered through the windows and caught the edge of something beneath her sleeve, a glimpse of navy ink, angular and deliberate, before she tugged the fabric down to her wrist without breaking rhythm. The cart secured, she moved to the medication dispensary. Dr. Mercer had rounded 2 hours earlier, writing orders in his careful, expensive handwriting, the kind that came from boarding schools and country clubs. She saw the requisition forms stacked on the desk, sutures, vascular clamps, hemostats, absorbable mesh. Quantities that made her pause. She pulled his surgical logs from the past 6 weeks, cross-referenced them against the supply orders he'd submitted. The numbers didn't match. Never did. He was ordering double what any procedure required. Sometimes triple. It was the kind of detail most nurses would overlook, the kind of thing that got lost in the white noise of hospital administration. But Laura had spent 12 years watching resources vanish in the field, watching good equipment disappear into the wrong hands, and she had developed a talent for arithmetic that couldn't be ignored. She was still holding the charts when Dr. Mercer came through the pediatric nursing station at 0847, moving with the easy confidence of a man who had never been questioned in his professional life. He was tall, expensively dressed despite the scrubs that hung over his shirt, his cologne something that probably cost more than Laura's monthly rent. He saw her there, bent slightly over the desk, her sleeves rolled up just an inch past her wrists, the edge of scarred skin visible above the cuff. His eyes narrowed, not with concern, but with something colder. Calculation. He watched her for a moment without speaking, then turned to address the morning shift meeting. "Good morning, people," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from a title printed in gold letters on a walnut door. "Before rounds, I wanted to address a few concerns about our pharmacy protocols. Some individuals have been spending a bit too much time reviewing the billing codes and supply requisitions." He said it lightly, almost as a joke, but his eyes never left Laura's face. It shows a lack of understanding about hospital hierarchy. There are people trained to handle those details. Other people's job is to follow orders, not audit them. The room shifted. Laura felt it the way you feel a pressure change in a plane, subtle but impossible to ignore. 2 of the residents exchanged glances. One of them, a third-year named Casey, suddenly became very focused on organizing the medication cart. The attending nurse, Sarah, cleared her throat and looked away. Dr. Mercer continued, his voice dropping into the register that made him sound concerned, paternal even. When people start questioning standard operating procedures, when they suggest that legitimate supply orders are somehow inappropriate, that creates friction. And friction creates problems for everyone. He smiled. The smile didn't reach his eyes. "We want to maintain a productive environment where everyone stays in their lane. Right? Everyone does what they're trained to do. Nothing more." "Of course, Dr. Mercer," someone said from the back. Laura's jaw was still. Her hands rested flat on the desk. She didn't look up from the charts. If you were watching her carefully, and Dr. Mercer was, you might have noticed that her breathing hadn't changed at all. Not even a tick upward. Not even the smallest reaction to being publicly dissected in front of the entire morning shift. He lingered for 30 seconds, waiting for something from her. A reaction. A defense. An apology. When none came, he adjusted his stethoscope and moved toward the patient rooms. The room went dead silent for maybe 3 seconds. Then the ordinary sounds resumed: monitors, the distant hiss of ventilators, the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum. But something had shifted. An invisible door had closed. At lunch, Laura sat in the break room at a table near the window that overlooked the parking lot. She had a container of leftover rice and vegetables that she'd prepped the night before, the kind of careful meal planning that came from someone who had learned to account for every calorie. She was halfway through when 3 nurses entered: Chen, Morrison, and Williams, the ones who usually sat at this table. They grabbed their coffees from the counter, executed what could only be described as a choreographed exit, and left without a word. The timing was too perfect to be accidental. Chen didn't even make eye contact. This was the 3rd time in as many weeks. Laura watched them go, their departure as synchronized as a military drill. She knew what was happening. She'd seen the pattern clearly enough by now. Dr. Mercer worked a room the way water works through a foundation: patient, pervasive, guaranteed to find the cracks. He had a gift for it, actually. She'd overheard him talking in the corridor with Marcus, one of the senior residents, 2 days ago. "I'm not saying there's a problem," Mercer had said, his voice low and confidential. "But you've heard about her background, right? Before she came here? The instability issues? That kind of thing doesn't just disappear. People like that, they struggle with clear hierarchical structures. You have to manage them carefully. Set boundaries. Let them know what's acceptable." Marcus had made a non-committal sound. But he'd been avoiding her since. People like that. The phrase had stuck with her. People like what? People who questioned the numbers? People who'd spent time in places where the ordinary rules didn't apply? People who'd seen what happened when you trusted the wrong person? She finished her lunch alone and threw the container away, rinsing it in the sink. Her forearms, scarred white and pink beneath the water, caught the light. She dried her hands carefully and pulled her sleeves down to her wrists. The tattoo, the anchor wrapped in the coils of a skull and a trident, small enough that it would fit in a 1/4-inch square, stayed hidden. That was the arrangement she'd made with herself. The past stayed in the past. The name and the rank and everything that came with it stayed locked away. Laura Bennett, pediatric nurse, was a new person. A clean person. Someone without complications. She walked the halls back toward the unit, passing the patient rooms where children in hospital gowns sat propped up on beds, their parents in uncomfortable chairs, everyone waiting for healing that came on schedule and with proper documentation. At 12:43, she checked the vital signs on a 6-year-old with a broken femur. At 13:15, she helped reposition an 8-year-old recovering from appendectomy. At 13:47, she caught Sarah, the attending nurse, watching her from across the station with an expression that looked like pity. Sarah looked away first. By 1400, the whisper campaign had apparently reached the pharmacy. Dimitri, who usually smiled at her when she came to pick up medications, now processed her requests with the minimum possible conversation. "Here's what you need," he said, sliding the trays across the counter without meeting her eyes. "That's it, right? That should be everything." His tone suggested he already knew the answer to his question. It suggested that people had told him what to think before she'd even arrived. The remainder of the shift moved in the strange underwater rhythm that had become normal. She worked. She charted. She moved through the unit like she was walking through glass, present but somehow separate. Around 1600, Dr. Mercer stopped her in the corridor. He didn't touch her, but he positioned himself close enough that she had to stop walking. His voice was pleasant, almost warm. "Laura, can I have a quick word?" It wasn't a question. It never was. "Of course," she said. Her voice came out even. Professional. The voice of someone with nothing to hide and nothing at stake. "I wanted to check in," he said. "You seem a little tense lately. Is everything okay? You know, sometimes people come into this profession with certain expectations about what the work is going to be like, and when those expectations don't match reality, it can create unnecessary stress." He tilted his head slightly, the picture of concern. "I wouldn't want you to burn out. We want you here. But we also need everyone on the same page about how things work in a professional medical setting." She met his eyes. This was the moment where something in her chest had learned to split into two separate people, one that existed in the normal world, and one that existed elsewhere. The second person was very quiet. She was very careful not to let that person show. "I understand," Laura said. "I'm focused on the patients. That's all I want." "Good," Mercer said, and he smiled. "Because your credentials are important to us. We just want to make sure everything checks out. Have you had a chance to send over your references from your previous positions? I know you mentioned some time overseas, but we'll need official documentation. Hospital policy." The way he said previous positions carried a weight that wasn't strictly medical. The way he said overseas made it sound like she'd been somewhere illicit. And the way he said official documentation made it clear that he already knew there wouldn't be any, because that work had never existed on paper. Because that work had existed in a different world, with different rules, and because the moment it was classified, it became, legally and professionally, invisible. "I'll look into it," she said. "Perfect," Mercer said. "Let me know what you find." He walked away. Laura stood in the corridor for exactly 2 seconds. Then she resumed her shift, her heart rate unchanged, her face empty of everything except professional attention. But in her locker, wrapped in a plastic bag beneath her personal items, was a photograph in grayscale. 14 people in desert camouflage, standing in front of a field hospital that no longer existed. 7 of those faces no longer existed either. And in her bedroom, in a closed closet in her apartment in Raleigh, North Carolina, was a folded flag that belonged to someone whose mother had been too broken to accept it at the memorial service. Someone whose mother had asked Laura to keep it instead. The shift ended at 1900. She clocked out and walked to her car in the parking lot, her sleeves pulled down despite the heat, her tattoo hidden, her credentials questioned by a surgeon who was very good at making other people's lives smaller and more difficult without ever raising his voice. She didn't know that within 72 hours, a Navy captain would arrive at St. Michael's with a training injury. She didn't know that he would be admitted to the very unit where she worked. And she didn't know that the moment he glimpsed the edge of that tattoo, the anchor, the skull, the trident, everything she had built to keep her old life hidden was going to collapse. Captain James Rhodes arrived at St. Michael's on a Wednesday at 2:44 p.m., and the rappelling accident that brought him there had left him looking like someone had taken his body apart and reassembled the pieces wrong. Compound fractures in both legs. Internal bleeding somewhere they couldn't quite locate on first pass. The kind of damage that made surgeons hold their breath and junior residents pray to gods they didn't believe in anymore. Laura read his chart in the ICU station and her hands went still on the keyboard. USS Halsey. She knew that name the way soldiers know the names of people they've never met but whose letters they've memorized. Michael's commanding officer. The man who had written to her 3 times in the last 14 months with updates on her son's performance, his character, his readiness, the only window she had into his world that she wasn't allowed to openly claim. She requested assignment to his case. Dr. Mercer denied it within 17 seconds, his voice tight and controlled as he passed her in the hallway. Your disciplinary status doesn't permit patient care assignments for command-level personnel, Nurse Bennett. I'm sure you understand. What he meant was, you're compromised, you're watched, you're useful only until I finish destroying you. but the charge nurse, Patricia Chen, overruled him because the unit was hemorrhaging staff and Rhodes had specifically requested someone who wouldn't flinch at his pain, which was a strange thing for a Navy captain to ask for unless someone had primed him with information about which nurse on this floor had the kind of composure that came from having already survived the unsurvivable. Laura changed into fresh scrubs, checked the medication cart twice, and walked into his room at 3:15 p.m. with the kind of calm that comes from having made peace with the fact that hiding and showing up are incompatible desires, and she could only choose one. Rhodes was a man built like a ship's anchor, broad shoulders, thick neck, the kind of presence that made the air pressure change when he entered a room. Right now he was held together by titanium rods and surgical tape and the promise of narcotics that barely touched the depth of his injury. His face was grey. His right leg was suspended at a 45-degree angle, and the dressing around his femur needed changing, which meant for hours of pain that no painkiller could fully blunt because narcotic tolerance was a liar's game and he'd already pushed past the useful threshold. Laura pulled on fresh gloves, the sound like rubber snapping against bone, and set up the dressing change station with the kind of efficient silence that said, "I've done this 1,000 times and I will do it 1,000 times more." She didn't ask if he was ready. Ready wasn't a choice that existed in trauma medicine. She said only, "Captain, this will hurt. I'll talk you through it." She began removing the outer dressing, and his hand shot out to grip hers so hard the circulation nearly stopped. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She used the steady cadence of someone who'd stood over wounded men in field hospitals where the walls were canvas and the explosions never quite finished echoing. Breathe in 4 counts. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold for 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now out for 4. His knuckles went white. His jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. And as her sleeve rode up while she was repositioning the gauze on his inner arm, the edge of the tattoo appeared, the anchor, precise black lines, and beneath it the curve of the skull and trident. Recognition hit his face like a physical force. His eyes locked onto the mark, and for one impossible second she saw him calculate, process, and arrive at a conclusion that should have been impossible because she had spent 3 years erasing that life, hiding those marks, becoming small enough that no one would ever connect the dots. "You remind me of someone," he whispered, and his voice carried the weight of a man who had just realized he was holding the hand of a legend. "Someone who saved my executive officer's life. Helmand Province. 2013, field hospital overrun, they were rotating out under fire, and one of our trauma surgeons went down, IED fragmentation. Someone picked up a combat knife and a 14-gauge angiocath and opened up his chest right there on the dirt because waiting for a proper surgical bay meant death." His eyes tracked the tattoo, the scar tissue on her forearms, the way her hands moved with absolute certainty. Everyone called her Valkyrie. Laura's hand trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of 3 years of silence collapsing in real time. She pulled her sleeve down with more force than was necessary and secured the bandage with movements that were suddenly too controlled, too military, too obviously the work of hands that had held lives together under conditions that would have shattered most people. "You're thinking of someone else, sir." Her voice came out softer than she intended, which was a mistake because softness suggested vulnerability and vulnerability was something she had trained out of herself in a place where showing weakness got people killed. That was a long time ago. Different person. But Rhodes was watching her with the intensity of a man whose mind was working through a problem at classified security clearance levels, and he made 3 phone calls that night after she left his room. 1 to JSOC. 1 to Camp Lejeune. 1 to a Marine colonel who had served in Helmand Province and would know the call signs, the operations, the names of the people who'd been buried in the official record. Laura didn't know about the calls. She was sitting alone in her car in the parking garage at 11:24 p.m., staring at her scarred hands on the steering wheel, trying to remember why she'd chosen a career where helping people meant staying visible, staying memorable, becoming the opposite of invisible. The thing about scars is they tell stories whether you want them to or not, and she'd made a mistake by thinking she could live in a hospital without someone eventually learning how to read her skin like a map. The next morning arrived with the kind of clinical cruelty only Thursday mornings could deliver. She was walking toward the pediatric unit with her lunch, a container of rice and vegetables she'd prepared at 5 a.m. because cooking gave her something to do with hands that didn't know how to be still, when she passed the break room. 3 nurses were there grabbing their coffees, and the moment they registered her presence, they moved. Not quickly, not obviously, but with the choreographed precision of people who had been trained by repetition and whisper campaigns to treat her like something contagious. Sarah Hartley, Michelle Gonzalez, Danny Park. They'd all been friendly 6 weeks ago. Now they filed out without making eye contact, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects feeding on her isolation. She sat alone at a table meant for 12 and ate her lunch without tasting it. By 9:19 a.m., Dr. Mercer had positioned himself outside a patient room where she was adjusting an 4-line. He waited until she was fully engaged with the medication port, until the family was watching from the bedside, until witnesses were optimally positioned. Then his voice cut across the room with the kind of casual cruelty that only people with power could afford to deploy. "Nurse Bennett, I need you to walk me through basic medication protocols again. Some of our less experienced staff need refreshers on procedures the rest of us learned in our first semester." He emphasized the words like he was carving them into her ribs, and 2 residents smirked because they understood they were being invited to participate in something that masqueraded as teaching but was actually execution by 1,000 small cuts. Laura's jaw tightened. She took one measured breath through her nose. She met his eyes across the room with the kind of composure that comes from knowing you've already survived worse: rockets, IED blasts, the weight of men dying in your hands because the universe had decided you should carry that burden alone. When she spoke, her voice was quiet enough that only the people closest heard it, which made it more cutting than if she'd shouted. "My protocols have never harmed a patient, Dr. Mercer." She returned to the medication line without waiting for his response, which was its own kind of power, the power of someone who had already decided this man's opinion was irrelevant. The resident stopped smirking. The family looked away. And Dr. Mercer felt something dangerous crystallize in his chest because she hadn't broken, hadn't flinched, hadn't given him the satisfaction of visible injury. He needed her to break before Rhodes started asking questions that would lead places Mercer had spent for years making sure nobody would ever look. He needed her compromised, discredited, neutralized. Which was exactly the moment Captain Rhodes made his phone calls, setting in motion something that would arrive in Raleigh whether Mercer was ready or not. Captain Rhodes's blood pressure began its descent at 18:47 hours, 14 minutes before the shift change. The numbers dropped like stones into still water: 128/72, then 119/68, then 110/61, and nobody watching the monitor called it out because nobody was watching. The 2 junior residents assigned to his care were both in the charting station, heads down, arguing about whether a 0.5 mg dose of midazolam counted as moderate sedation or light sedation. The kind of argument that happened in teaching hospitals across America while patients bled into their abdomens. Laura saw the numbers first. She was 3 rooms down, adjusting a pediatric patient's 4, when the monitor registered the drop in her peripheral vision, that particular cadence of beeping that meant something had shifted in Rhodes's vasculature. Not an alarm. Not yet. Just a whisper. She set down her syringe and moved toward his room, muscle memory taking over, the same instinct that had carried her through Helmand province when her field hospital took incoming fire and the triage system dissolved into pure survival mathematics. The door was sealed with a printed notice, laminated and professional, per physician order, RN Bennett restricted from patient care. Authorized staff only. She could read it from the corridor. Mercer's handwriting, even in the printed directive, carried that particular precision of someone who documented everything for future court proceedings. She could not go in. The restriction was flagged in the system, flagged in the physical space, flagged in a way that guaranteed she would create a disciplinary incident if she violated it. One more violation. One more piece of paper for Mercer's binder. But inside that room, Rhodes's abdomen was beginning to distend. Subtle. Barely visible to an untrained eye. But she could see it from the hallway, could see the way his shoulders tensed with pain he was trying to hide, could see the grey undertone creeping into his skin like rain clouds moving across a valley. The surgical repair was failing. The anastomosis, the connection point where Mercer had sewn the vessels back together with his meticulous surgeon's precision, was leaking. Laura moved to the nurse's station, pulled up the chart on the workstation, and read the timeline. Post-op vitals stable for 14 hours. Last check at 16:45. No documented assessment in the past 122 minutes. The two residents were still debating sedation protocols. "Check Rhodes," she said. Not a question. Not a request. The tone came from somewhere deeper than her voice, somewhere that remembered commands in language designed to make men move without thinking. The resident, the taller one, David Chen, whom she'd trained herself 3 weeks prior, looked up. "Mercer said you're restricted from." "I'm not entering the room." "I'm telling you to enter the room." "Check his vitals. Palpate the abdomen. Look at his color. Now." There was something in her voice. He stood without finishing the sentence about sedation protocols. 30 seconds. That's all it took. The resident returned with his face arranged in the particular expression of someone who had just realized he'd almost killed a patient through inattention. Blood pressure 98/52. Abdomens distended. He's complaining of abdominal pain. Laura was already moving toward the nurse's station phone. "Page Dr. Mercer. Tell him we have post-op hemorrhage in for 12. We need cardiostat, and we need it now." The resident hesitated. "But he said you're restricted." "He said I'm restricted from patient care. I'm restricting you from the care you're about to fail." She picked up the phone. Her hand was steady. "Page him now, or I page him myself." The page went out at 18:52. Dr. Mercer received it in the physician's lounge, where he was reviewing the chart for Captain James Rhodes with the careful attention of a man examining a problem that might solve itself. He'd already done the mathematics. Post-operative hemorrhage in a patient with compromised vascular architecture. The bleed was happening. Rhodes had, at maximum, 20 minutes of viable perfusion pressure remaining before his organs began to fail. If Mercer called Duke Medical Center for the cardiothoracic surgeon, the specialist would need roughly 23 minutes to arrive via helicopter. If Rhodes died before the helicopter landed, Mercer's actions could be characterized as reasonable medical judgment in an emergency situation, no culpability there. If Rhodes survived, Mercer had documentation that Laura Bennett, the unauthorized person who kept pushing for access to the patient, had been removed from care specifically because of her unstable emotional attachment. He had built this with surgical precision. Each document, each incident report, each carefully worded notation in the medical record. All of it converging on a single administrative action that would remove her from the hospital and eliminate her access to whatever classified military history she was hiding. The page came through, and Mercer stood, moving with the unhurried pace of a man whose plan was unfolding exactly as designed. He called Duke. He documented the conversation. He noted the ETA of the cardiac surgeon, 23 minutes, weather dependent. He then walked to the unit, entered Rhodes's room, performed a brief examination that confirmed what he already knew, the surgical site was hemorrhaging, and exited to deliver his prognosis to the waiting junior residents. "Prepare for possible re-exploration," he said. His voice carried the measured tone of a doctor in control. "The surgeon from Duke will evaluate when he arrives. In the interim, maintain fluid resuscitation. 2 liters normal saline wide open. 2 units PRBC standing by for transfusion. If his systolic drops below 80, I want a damage control protocol ready." He did not look at Laura. She was standing near the medication dispensary, and he did not look at her because looking at her would require acknowledging that she had been right about the residents not being ready for a complication this serious. Looking at her would require a moment of weakness that would not fit the narrative he was constructing. The next morning, the disciplinary board convened at 0800. Laura's name appeared in red ink on the official unit bulletin board, listed under pending investigation, restricted duties. 6 policy violations. Each one a revelation, each one documented with the precision that had made Mercer one of the hospital's most respected surgeons. Unauthorized attempt to override physician orders. Medication narcotic protocol violation, 3 counts, with alleged dates and times. Emotional attachment to patient endangering clinical judgment. Breach of restricted access boundary. The dates on the violations were interesting. 3 of them predated her employment at St. Michael's by 4 months. The documentation was flawless. Hospital letterhead. His signature in black ink. Everything formatted according to the Joint Commission standards. A binder 3 inches thick, which he presented to the unit director and 2 hospital administrators at 0815, was so comprehensively damning that the administrators didn't ask questions. Questions implied doubt. Questions implied that Mercer, a surgeon with 32 years of experience and a reputation that extended across 2 states, might have fabricated evidence. Laura received the notification at home. A single email marked urgent, with the subject line disciplinary action, confidential. She opened it on her laptop while rain hammered the windows of her apartment, each drop sounding like static on a dead broadcast. The language was corporate and precise. Pending further investigation, your access to patient care areas is restricted. You are not to enter the hospital until the formal hearing, scheduled for 1,600 hours, Friday the 16th of June. Today was Tuesday. She sat at the kitchen table and read the 6 allegations. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench. She simply read, the way she had once read tactical briefs before operations in Kandahar province, the way soldiers read orders that might get them killed or make them heroes depending on variables outside their control. Medication narcotic protocol violation, narcotic administration without proper documentation, the 3rd of April, 2024. Laura had been working in the pediatric wing on the 3rd of April. She had administered no narcotics on that date, had not even been in the adult care unit where Rhodes was recovering. The incident log would show this. The system logs would show this. But the investigation wouldn't happen until Friday. 3 days. That's how long Mercer needed. 3 days before the system could catch up with his documentation, before her access logs could be cross-referenced, before anyone noticed that the timestamps on his allegations didn't match the reality of her location on those dates. She picked up her phone and saw 6 missed calls from Captain Rhodes's room. The hospital switchboard. Not messages. Not voicemails. Just the evidence that he'd been trying to reach her. The phone rang. She almost didn't answer it. Laura. His voice was steady, but underneath the steadiness was something like pain. They told me you're not working. They told me there's an investigation. There is. She didn't deny it. No point in denial. The facts would come out or they wouldn't, and lying to Rhodes now wouldn't change the timeline. Mercer told me you violated narcotic protocols. That you had emotional attachment bias that was affecting your clinical judgment. Rhodes was quiet for a moment, and she could hear the ventilator behind him, that particular wheeze of someone whose lungs were still learning to work without mechanical assistance. I know that's not true. You don't know that, Laura said. But her voice was steady. You've known me for 4 days, Captain. You don't know me. I know you know what you're doing, Rhodes said. I know you saved my life in that first 30 minutes, before Mercer even saw me. I know the medication logs are falsified because I was awake during those dates, and you weren't even on my unit. He paused. And I know a Navy Cross doesn't grow on just anybody's wrist. The tattoo. He was talking about the tattoo. Stop, Laura said. Don't say anything else. Don't make calls. Don't do anything that gives Mercer an excuse to claim you're being influenced or coerced or... It's too late for that, Rhodes said. He sounded almost calm about it, the way officers sound when they're already inside the disaster and the only thing left is to manage the collapse. I already called my chain of command. I already told them about your tattoo. About your rank. About Helmand province, 2013, Operation Sandstorm. He waited. I know who you are, Captain Bennett. And they're sending someone. The rain continued its assault on the windows. Laura didn't say anything. She didn't ask who was coming. She didn't ask how much time she had before everything she'd hidden emerged into the fluorescent light of a hospital investigation. "Rest," she said finally. "You're post-operative. Your body needs recovery more than it needs a phone call." But Rhodes didn't hang up. Neither did Laura. They both just listened to the sound of machines breathing, the sound of a patient and a nurse separated by doors and restrictions and lies that were beginning to fracture under the weight of truth. When she finally disconnected, it was 2,247 hours. 3 days until the hearing. 3 days until Mercer's fabricated evidence would be challenged by hospital systems that could prove where she'd actually been, what she'd actually done. Or 3 days for the situation to escalate beyond the point where medical records and system logs mattered at all. She looked at the folded flag on her shelf, the one she'd been given at a ceremony she wasn't allowed to attend, representing the life of someone whose name she couldn't speak and whose death she still hadn't fully accepted. Then she looked back at her phone, waiting for the call that would change everything. The monitor screamed at 0300. Not a beep. Not a regular alarm cycling through its programmed crescendo. A full-throated scream, the sound a machine makes when it's watching something die in real time. Laura's head snapped up from the pediatric station where she'd been pretending to chart, though her eyes had never left the ICU telemetry board. Captain Rhodes's pressure was dropping. 68/40. 55/30. The surgical repair was bleeding. Internal hemorrhage spreading through his thorax like spilled ink through water. She moved before the code blue announcement even crackled through the overhead speakers. No hesitation. No calculation. Just the muscle memory of Helmand province, of field hospitals where hesitation meant body bags and triage meant choosing who got to live. The ICU doors swung open and Laura found the nightmare unfolding, 2 residents frozen in orbit around Rhodes's bed like planets that had stopped rotating. The first resident, a woman named Chen, was hyperventilating so hard her hands trembled against the crash cart. The second, a man named Morrison, was frantically scrolling through his phone, calling the cardiothoracic surgeon who was 20 minutes away at Duke Medical Center. 20 minutes that Captain Rhodes did not have. His lips were already turning the color of old bruises. Laura's voice dropped an octave, carrying the weight of commands that had moved men through ambush fire and kept hearts beating in impossible circumstances. "Get me a thoracotomy tray. Now. Not in 30 seconds. Now." Chen jumped. Morrison stopped scrolling. 3 nurses materialized from the hallway like they'd been waiting for permission to obey someone who actually knew what she was doing. The tray arrived in 20 seconds. Laura tore open the sterile field, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of muscle memory that never forgot, even when the woman wearing those hands had tried to bury it under 7 years of pediatric vital signs and deflected questions. She cracked Rhodes's chest open, not with the scalpel she'd used in Helmand where supplies had run out and a combat knife became a surgical instrument in the hands of someone desperate enough to save 14 lives before the Taliban overran the compound. This time she had actual equipment. This time she had light and anesthesia and people who could follow orders. Her hands went into his thorax, bare hands because there wasn't time for a second glove, her fingers finding the bleeder before her eyes could fully process what they were looking at. Blood, warm and slick and absolutely certain in its message, repair failure. Myocardial infarction. Death approaching like an aircraft on approach. "Talk to me, Captain." Her voice was steady, the same cadence she'd used in Helmand when the room went dark and the only thing separating her patients from the wrong side of forever was the certainty in her voice. "You're not done yet. Your crew needs you. My son needs you." She clamped the bleeder with her bare hands, found the secondary hemorrhage point with the precision of someone who'd done this with surgical tools fashioned from what was available and desperation that had no other options. "Stay with me. Sinus rhythm. Come on, stay with me." The monitor wavered. Steadied. Climbed. The blood pressure responded to her hands and her voice like they were conjugate, together they made the impossible happen. 82/50. 90/60. Stabilizing. That's when the doors burst open and Dr. Mercer arrived to find her wrist deep in Rhodes's thorax, her forearms painted red, her face the color of stone, her eyes locked on the surgical field with the singular focus of someone operating in a war zone where civilian law meant nothing and outcome meant everything. The color drained from Mercer's face, then flooded back red. His hands clenched at his sides. "Step back from that patient." His voice was barely controlled, the tone of someone watching his entire architecture of lies collapse in real time. "Security. Security to ICU now. She's practicing outside her scope. This is a violation of Regulation 47C and every standard of care protocol we have." "Captain Rhodes is stable," Laura said without looking up. Her hands didn't move. The procedure wasn't finished. The secondary repair needed completion and she was the only person in that room with the muscle memory to execute it without sending him back into shock. "I don't care if he's Jesus Christ reincarnated. You are not a surgeon. You are a..." Mercer's jaw worked like he was trying to force the word out through concrete. "Remove her. Now." Security arrived with the speed of people who'd been briefed and were waiting for permission to do what they already knew needed doing. Laura finished the suture, 14 years of training compressed into the last 3 inches of thread and precision, before she even acknowledged they were there. The monitors climbed. Pressure stabilized. Cardiac output normalized. Rhodes's color shifted from the shade of old denim back toward something resembling human. Only then did she step back and let them lead her away. "Her records are fraudulent," Mercer was saying to the assembled staff, his voice climbing toward hysteria. "Her credentials don't check out. Her military records don't exist. And she just committed career suicide." He was pointing at Laura like she was evidence of something. Like the fact that she'd just pulled a Navy captain back from the edge of irreversibility was somehow proof of her deception rather than her competence. The security guard's hand touched her elbow. Not rough. Not angry. Just inevitable, like gravity. Laura let them walk her out at dawn. The rain had started again, the kind that falls in sheets and doesn't distinguish between who's walking through it and who's hiding from it. She carried the cardboard box they'd let her gather from her locker, the cracked coffee mug that read "World's Best Mom" in fading letters, a dying succulent she'd been watering out of obligation more than hope, and the photograph. Helmand Province. 3rd Platoon, Charlie Company, 2008. 18 faces grinning at a camera that didn't know half of them would be names on a wall at Arlington by the end of the decade. She could name every single one. She could trace the path of every single loss like a map of scar tissue she carried in places no one could see. The bus stop was 6 blocks away. The rain turned her sleeves dark, but she didn't roll them up. The water just pooled in the creases of her burned scars, the ones that pulled tight when she was cold, the ones that had made her think she could hide everything under long sleeves and careful words and a job nobody noticed. The bus came. She boarded. The driver didn't look at her. Nobody on the bus looked at her. She was just another person going nowhere in the rain, carrying a box that held everything that mattered and nothing that could save her. But Captain Rhodes was awake that next morning, and the moment the monitors showed him stable enough to communicate, he made calls. Military calls. The kind that don't route through civilian channels. By noon, a Marine colonel named Marcus Webb was driving north from Camp Lejeune with a citation in his dress uniform and orders from someone at a command level that didn't negotiate about who got brought into hospital rooms. Security tried to stop Laura when they came to her temporary address, a motel room 6 miles from St. Michael's that she'd paid for with cash because she didn't trust anything else. But the colonel had clearance levels that made security personnel into obstacles to be politely redirected, and within an hour, Laura was standing in Captain Rhodes's ICU room with her hand shaking not from fear but from restraint, from the effort of containing everything she'd buried. Rhodes gripped her wrist. Deliberately rotated it. Exposed the anchor tattoo beneath the skull and trident that marked her as something more than a nurse, something other than a woman hiding. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried like command authority, like something that had been waiting to be spoken. "Valkyrie. The room went quiet in a way that only happens when people suddenly understand they've been standing next to someone extraordinary without recognizing the shape of the extraordinary they were looking at. Colonel Webb stepped from the corner chair. She hadn't even seen him standing there, the way trained observers know how to occupy space without being seen, and pulled a citation from his dress uniform jacket. When he read, his voice filled the corridor like artillery. Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism. Lieutenant Commander Laura Bennett, call sign Valkyrie. For conducting emergency trauma surgery under direct enemy fire in Helmand province. For saving 14 lives when her field hospital was overrun. The words hung in the air like they were the most ordinary thing in the world, and also like they were reshaping the architecture of everyone's understanding of who Laura Bennett actually was. She didn't flinch. She didn't acknowledge the stares pressing against the ICU windows. She just let her arm stay extended, let the tattoo show, let the 18-year-old call sign be spoken into the fluorescent-lit present. And then Rear Admiral Patricia Chen walked through the door in dress whites, and the entire equation shifted again. The hospital board met at 8 a.m. sharp in the administration conference room on the 3rd floor. Laura wasn't invited. She found out when the security guard handed her a termination letter printed on St. Michael's letterhead, effective immediately, pending final disciplinary review. Mercer had spent the night building his case. A 3-inch binder sat in front of the board, personnel complaints he'd solicited from nurses who'd never worked with her, time card discrepancies he'd invented by cross-referencing shift rotations, a formal motion for termination with cause citing 6 separate policy violations, each one documented in his meticulous handwriting. The administrators listened while he explained that her military background couldn't be verified through standard credentialing channels, that her nursing license showed gaps they couldn't account for, that no official records existed to corroborate her education or training. It wasn't a request for due process. It was her execution. She sat in the break room waiting for the decision, her shift badge already collected, her access card deactivated. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer. She didn't cry. She didn't call a lawyer. She sat with her coffee cooling in a chipped mug and watched the clock move to 9 a.m., then 10, then 11. By noon, it was official. The letter said 3-month severance. The letter didn't say it was contingent on her silence. That evening, she stood at the bus stop on Fayetteville Street in the rain. The cardboard box sat on her lap, the contents of her locker. Inside, a pair of combat boots she'd kept in the bottom, laces still stiff with dust from Helmand. A stethoscope her son had given her before his first deployment. A cracked ceramic mug that read "World's Best Mom" in fading letters. A dying succulent she'd been meaning to water for 3 weeks. And a photograph, the edges worn soft from handling, showing her entire unit standing in front of the field hospital in Kandahar province, November 2009. 23 faces. She could name every one. Half of them were gone now. Marcus Chen was the one whose folded flag sat in her bedroom closet back home, preserved in tissue paper because his mother had been too broken to accept it at the ceremony. Laura had taken it instead. She carried it for 3 years before Marcus's sister finally asked her to keep it, to honor it the way Marcus would have wanted. The rain fell harder. A taxi splashed through the gutter, water spraying the bench. She didn't move. She sat there for an hour, maybe more, staring at the faces in the photograph, thinking about muscle memory and second chances and the precise moment when she decided to hide everything that made her who she was. The rain tasted like copper and salt. The next morning, Captain James Rhodes refused his sedation. The nurse tried. The pharmacist tried. He just shook his head, his jaw wired, his voice barely audible through the pain. Get her. The one with the anchor. Get Bennett. The resident didn't understand. The charge nurse hesitated. But Rhodes repeated it, harder this time, pulling at the 4 lines, and finally someone made the call. 30 seconds later, Laura pushed through the doors to his room in scrubs that didn't belong to her anymore, borrowed from a colleague who didn't ask questions. Rhodes reached out. His hand found her wrist. His fingers rotated it slowly, carefully, until the tattoo was visible in the morning light, an anchor and trident with a skull and crossbones, the ink faded but unmistakable beneath the burned scars. He whispered one word, "Valkyrie." His voice broke on the second syllable. She didn't pull her arm away. She stood there and let him look, let him see, let the 18-year-old call sign that everyone was supposed to forget finally exist in the present tense again. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The 4-pump hissed. And then a voice from the corner chair cut through the white noise like a blade. A Marine colonel stood up. His dress uniform looked like he'd never sat down in it, all pressed seams and ribbons earned in blood and sand. He pulled a citation from his jacket, actual paper, official military letterhead, the kind that doesn't get issued without approval from flags all the way up the chain. His voice was parade ground loud, the kind of command voice that makes civilians feel small. Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism. Lieutenant Commander Laura Bennett. Call sign Valkyrie. For conducting emergency trauma surgery under direct enemy fire in Helmand province. 14 lives saved when her field hospital was overrun. 14 people who would not be alive today. He read each line like a benediction. Each word hung in the air. This citation was issued 14 years ago. This citation was never formally received. This citation is now being presented pending full review of classified service records and formal reinstatement of commendations. The door opened. A 2-star general in dress whites. Rear Admiral Patricia Chen, Chief Medical Officer of Naval Operations. She didn't say anything. She just walked to the foot of Rhodes's bed, looked at Laura's scarred forearms, at the anchor tattoo now exposed, at the woman standing there in borrowed scrubs with her sleeve rolled up for the first time in 3 years. And then she snapped to attention. Her hand came up in salute, a formal, measured gesture, the kind reserved for fallen soldiers and Medal of Honor recipients. The kind that says, "I see you. I know what you did. I know what was taken from you." The decorations on Chen's uniform caught the light, 5 rows of ribbons, including a Purple Heart and a Navy Commendation Medal with Valor device. She held the salute for 3 full seconds. In that time, the entire floor seemed to hold its breath. Then Mercer pushed through the door. Protocols. Procedures. The patient still in post-operative recovery. We can't have civilian staff in the room without proper credentialing, and he stopped. The words died. His eyes found Rear Admiral Chen. Then the colonel. Then the badge hanging from Laura's borrowed scrubs that said visitor. The color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. Behind him, 2 people in dark jackets stepped into the room. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Special Agent Torres was the first one to speak. His voice was quiet but carried the weight of 6 months of investigation, phantom orders, inflated medical supply billing, thousands of dollars funneled to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Bahamas. Dr. Mercer. We've been following your supply chain irregularities since April. But it wasn't until you tried to falsify Captain Bennett's personnel file that we had digital evidence. Torres held up a tablet. Screen after screen of hospital database logs. You logged into the credentialing system 17 times in the past week. Trying to backdate disciplinary complaints. Creating incident reports with timestamps that prove you were in surgery when you claim to have witnessed the violations. And the supply orders, Torres swiped through medical equipment shipments. Equipment purchased with hospital funds. Equipment shipped to addresses that didn't exist. Equipment resold through vendor accounts registered to Mercer's name. You got sloppy when you got desperate. Mercer actually ran. He actually turned for the door, his hand up, his mouth opening to deny or explain or bargain. The second agent moved and blocked his path like a mountain. The cuffs clicked shut. No drama. No raised voices. Just the metal sound of restraint, final and audible. The perp walk down the main corridor happened in front of everyone. Past the nurse's station where he'd orchestrated Laura's isolation, his whisper campaign spreading like contamination. Past the disciplinary board where her name still appeared in red ink, 6 violations that never happened, all signed off by Mercer's careful hand. Past the break room where 3 nurses stood frozen in the doorway, watching their director being escorted out in handcuffs. His physician's license was suspended before he cleared the hospital parking lot. Revoked entirely within a week. The federal charges took longer: wire fraud, conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, falsification of official documents. But the investigation moved quickly once they had leverage. By the time his trial date was set, Dr. Mercer had become just Mercer, no title, no license, no credentials that mattered anymore. 6 months later, through the window of her new office on the 4th floor of St. Michael's, Laura watched him load boxes into a medical supply van in the prison contractor parking lot. His hands did the lifting work himself. No one to delegate to. No one to order around. His fingers looked clumsy with the weight. The boxes looked heavy. She turned back to her desk where her new nameplate read Director of Trauma Services. Her sleeves were rolled up. Both of them. The burn scars on her forearms caught the light, not hidden, not ashamed, just visible as part of the person she actually was. Captain Rhodes's handwritten thank you note sat on her desk, framed now, beside the photograph from Helmand province with all 23 faces accounted for. Next to that frame was a new one, her son Michael in dress whites, promoted to lieutenant, standing beside Admiral Chen at a change of command ceremony. And beside that, finally, the folded flag. Marcus Chen's folded flag. In a shadow box with a brass plaque engraved, SSGT Marcus Chen, Helmand Province, never forgotten. A knock at her door. 3 former combat medics she'd been mentoring, their own scars and stories finally validated by someone who understood what it meant to carry weight that civilians couldn't see. She waved them in. The break room now filled when she entered instead of emptying. Staff asked her advice about procedures, about handling trauma patients, about transitioning veterans into civilian practice. Admiral Chen visited to present her with a delayed Purple Heart in a private ceremony, 14 years overdue, for wounds sustained during the field hospital attack that official records claimed never happened. It happened. She still remembered the smell of smoke and blood and antiseptic mixed together, the sound of small arms fire hitting the surgical tent, the weight of Marcus's hand in hers as she worked to stop the bleeding. The Purple Heart came with a formal apology from the CIA liaison who'd buried Operation Sandstorm. The protocol had been classified. The personnel had been erased. It had been a necessary evil, she was told. Laura had just nodded. She understood operational security. She understood that some people didn't get to be heroes in public. Sometimes they just got to save lives in the dark and keep walking. But now the dark had a light on it. Now her name was on the commendations board. Now when young veterans came through her trauma bay, they could see someone who'd been where they'd been, done what they'd done, and chosen to build something instead of break. She ran her fingers over her scarred forearms, traced the anchor and trident tattoo she no longer hid, and thought about the precise moment when hiding had stopped being survival and started being just another kind of dying. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you've ever been underestimated for who you are or what you've survived, share this story. Subscribe. Comment. Tell us, have you ever had to hide your scars to fit in?